Police officers arrest Black Judge and panic when they discover who he is. James Carter adjusted the knot of his tie as he navigated his sleek, black sedan through the glowing streets of downtown Atlanta. The hum of the engine was steady, almost soothing, a sharp contrast to the whirlwind of thoughts racing through his mind. The gala he had just left was nothing short of spectacular, a celebration of excellence, where James had been one of the honored guests. As a highly respected judge, his presence demanded attention, but as he drove, the glamorous applause from earlier faded into the background, replaced by memories of a very different reality. James hadn't always been this version of himself, the polished, confident man seated in a car that practically symbolized success. Growing up in a poor neighborhood on the south side of the city, he'd known what it was like to struggle. The streets of his childhood weren't paved with opportunity. They were lined with hurdles, often shaped by the color of his skin. Even now, the ghosts of those days lingered, whispering reminders that success didn't shield him from everything. As the city lights reflected off his windshield, James couldn't help but feel the weight of his dual existence. He was a man who had climbed his way to the top, but to some, he was still just another black man in a world that often judged him by his skin before his accomplishments. The rumble of the car's engine was a rare moment of calm in a life that often felt like a battle. But James had learned to carry that burden with quiet resilience. Tonight, though, he felt the air shift. Something about this drive home felt different, though he couldn't put his finger on why. Let me know if this feels like the right tone and structure, or if you'd like me to tweak anything further before we continue. As James approached a red light at the intersection of Main and Fifth, the city's vibrant hum seemed to dim. The soft jazz playing on his stereo, the glow of neon signs reflecting on the windshield, all of it faded when the unmistakable flash of red and blue lights illuminated his rearview mirror. His stomach tightened instinctively, the familiar unease creeping in like an old, unwelcome friend. Behind him, a police cruiser slowed to match his pace. The vehicle hovered, almost predatory, and James could feel the weight of their gaze piercing through the glass. He straightened his back, gripping the steering wheel tightly, but deliberately, careful not to make any sudden movements. He had been here before. Not this exact street or this exact night, but in this exact moment. Judged, watched, assessed. The red light seemed to stretch into eternity as the cruiser inched closer. James glanced at the side mirror and saw the silhouettes of two officers inside. They weren't just observing him. They were measuring him. His tailored suit, his clean-shaven face, his calm demeanor. None of it mattered. To them, he was simply a man in a car they didn't think he belonged in. The light turned green, but the police car didn't move. Instead, it drifted to the lane beside him, rolling up parallel. James' heart pounded as he felt their stares intensify. The officer in the passenger seat leaned slightly forward, as if trying to get a better look. James forced himself to keep his eyes on the road ahead, though every instinct screamed for him to look back. "Breathe," he whispered to himself. The calm he projected wasn't just for show. It was survival. He'd learned from a young age that black men didn't get the luxury of reacting. Not to suspicion, not to disrespect, not even to outright hostility. Every move had to be calculated, measured, like playing a game where the stakes were life itself. As he drove through the intersection, the cruiser stayed beside him, inching forward just enough to nudge him into action. And then, with a sudden burst of sound, the siren blared, a sharp, short wail that broke the night's fragile peace. James tightened his grip on the wheel and exhaled slowly. "Here we go," he muttered under his breath. The officer in the passenger seat gestured sharply for him to pull over. James hesitated for only a fraction of a second before signaling and guiding his car to the curb. His mind raced, not with fear, but with the same mental checklist he'd run through every time he found himself in situations like this. Keep your hands visible. Speak clearly. Don't make any sudden moves. As the car came to a stop, he took a deep breath and rested his hands on the steering wheel, fingers splayed in plain sight. His heart hammered, but his face remained calm. He'd been here before, too many times for it to feel anything other than routine. In the rearview mirror, James saw the driver's side door of the cruiser open. One of the officers stepped out, his figure illuminated by the harsh glow of the streetlights. The man's expression was unreadable, but his body language spoke volumes. His hand rested on the holster at his side as he approached the driver's side window, his posture tense and authoritative. James watched as the officer leaned in, his face now visible, a mixture of suspicion and something else, something colder. "License and registration," the officer barked, his tone clipped and impatient. James nodded and moved slowly, deliberately, reaching for the glove compartment. He could feel the officer's eyes watching every movement, like a hawk waiting for a misstep. "Stay calm," he reminded himself again. "You've done nothing wrong." But he knew better than to assume that mattered. The air around him felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if the entire city was holding its breath. James handed over his documents, his hand steady, but his mind bracing for what he knew was coming next. James watched the officer examine his license and registration, his eyes darting between the documents and James himself. The man's face twisted into a skeptical frown, the kind James knew too well. It wasn't just suspicion, it was disbelief, as if the mere existence of a black man in a luxury car was a crime in itself. "This your car?" the officer asked, his tone flat but edged with accusation. James held his gaze, keeping his voice steady. "Yes, sir. It's registered in my name, as you can see." The officer's lips twitched, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to his partner, who had exited the cruiser and was now standing a few feet back, his hand resting on his belt. Their silent exchange was brief but telling, the kind of look that didn't need words. James clenched his jaw, but his expression didn't waver. He'd been through this before, the endless cycle of having to justify his own success, to prove that he deserved the life he had worked so hard to build. The officer handed the documents back, but didn't step away. Instead, he leaned slightly closer, his eyes narrowing. "Mind if I ask what you do for a living?" James exhaled slowly, through his nose. He knew where this was going, and every fiber of his being screamed at him to end it here, to shut it down. But he didn't. "Not yet. I'm a judge," he said plainly, his voice calm but firm. The officer blinked, clearly taken aback, but quickly masked his reaction with a scoff. "A judge," he repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. "A judge driving this kind of car? That's a first." James forced a tight smile, though his knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel. "I work hard, officer," he said simply, keeping his voice neutral. But his words didn't seem to matter. The second officer, clearly growing impatient, stepped closer to the car and leaned down to peer into the window. His eyes roamed over James, then the interior of the car, like he was searching for something, anything, that would justify their actions. "Step out of the vehicle," the second officer ordered, his voice sharper than the first. James arched a brow. "Is there a reason for that?" he asked, his tone carefully measured. He already knew the answer, but he wanted to hear them say it. "Just do as we say," the first officer snapped, his hand now resting dangerously close to the weapon at his side. "We don't want any trouble." James let out a quiet sigh, his patience thinning but still intact. Slowly, he reached for the door handle and pushed it open. As he stepped out, the cool night air hit his face, but it did little to cool the simmering frustration bubbling beneath the surface. The two officers stood close now, their eyes boring into him with a mix of suspicion and silent challenge. James towered over them slightly, his posture calm but unyielding. He was no stranger to intimidation tactics, but he refused to let them rattle him. The second officer gestured toward the hood of the car. "Hands on the car," he barked. James hesitated for a moment, the indignity of the situation threatening to overwhelm him. But then he moved, placing his hands on the cool metal surface. The humiliation burned in his chest, but he kept his face neutral. The first officer stepped forward, patting him down with rough, practiced hands. James stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, as memories of similar moments from his youth came flooding back. Back then, he had been powerless, a teenager with no voice. But now he was different. "Got anything on you we should know about?" the officer asked, his voice laced with mockery. James turned his head slightly, meeting the man's gaze for the first time since stepping out of the car. "Only what's on those documents," he said, his voice steady. "The truth." The officer frowned, his expression flickering with something between annoyance and discomfort. He pulled back and exchanged another glance with his partner, who seemed almost disappointed. They weren't finding what they were looking for, because there was nothing to find. But James knew this wasn't about finding anything. This was about control, about making a statement. And no matter how calmly he handled it, no matter how polite or cooperative he was, the message was clear. To them, he didn't belong. "Must be nice," the second officer said suddenly, his tone biting. "Driving a car like this, living large. Guess some people just get lucky." James inhaled sharply, but said nothing. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let himself be baited now. James stood with his hands pressed against the hood of his car, the cold metal beneath his palms, doing little to numb the simmering heat of indignation swelling in his chest. The street around him seemed to dissolve, the hum of passing cars fading into a low murmur as the weight of the moment bore down on him. He had been here before, but this time, something was different. This wasn't just about him. It felt bigger, heavier, as if every unjust encounter he'd ever had was converging right here on this dimly lit street. Behind him, the first officer rummaged through his pockets, his hands quick and invasive, while the second officer lingered a few feet away, arms crossed and gaze sharp. James kept his breathing steady, though the humiliation felt like a weight pressing against his chest. "Look at this guy," the second officer said with a smirk, his voice carrying just loud enough for James to hear. "Dressed up like he's heading to court. Wonder what he's hiding under all that polish." The comment stung more than James wanted to admit. He had spent his entire life working to rise above the stereotypes, the assumptions, the expectations that men like these officers so casually placed on people like him. And yet here he was, successful, accomplished, respected, but reduced in their eyes to nothing more than a suspect in a nice car. "Got anything to say for yourself?" the first officer finally spoke, his tone laced with condescension as he stepped back from James. James slowly turned his head, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with a quiet, controlled rage. "I've said everything I needed to when I gave you my license and registration," he said calmly. "What more do you want?" The officer's lips curled into a faint sneer. "We want the truth. And I don't mean whatever fairy tale you're spinning about being a judge. A guy like you doesn't just work hard and end up in a car like this. So why don't you stop playing games and tell us what you really do?" James felt his stomach tighten, a sickening mix of fury and disbelief churning inside him. He thought about the years he had spent building his life brick by brick, the nights he had stayed up studying while the world around him slept, the sacrifices he had made to climb a ladder that had always seemed tilted against him. And now, all of it was being dismissed with a single sentence, erased by their prejudice. "I've already told you," James said, his voice sharp but measured. "I'm a judge. And if you don't believe me, check my documents again." The second officer, who had been silent until now, stepped forward with an impatient grunt. "Enough of this," he snapped. "Turn around." James' hands curled into fists against the hood of the car as he heard the unmistakable sound of handcuffs being unsnapped from a belt. The officer grabbed his wrists, yanking them behind his back with an unnecessary roughness that made James wince. The click of the cuffs locking around his wrists was deafening. James closed his eyes for a moment, forcing himself to swallow the anger rising in his throat. He could feel the stares of passers-by now, drivers slowing down to gawk at the scene, some even pulling out their phones to record. He could imagine what they saw: a tall black man in a suit, handcuffed next to an expensive car, flanked by two officers who looked all too pleased with themselves. "Let's see how talkative you are down at the station," the first officer said, his tone smug as he grabbed James' arm and began leading him toward the patrol car. As James was guided toward the back seat of the cruiser, he glanced over his shoulder, catching a glimpse of his reflection in the car's window. For a moment, He barely recognized himself, not because of what he looked like, but because of what this moment represented. He had spent his entire career fighting for justice, defending those who couldn't defend themselves, and yet here he was, powerless against a system that saw him as nothing more than a threat. The officer shoved him into the back seat of the cruiser, slamming the door shut with a force that echoed down the street. As the car began to move, James rested his cuffed hands on his lap and stared out the window, the city blurring past him. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his frustration, his anger, his disappointment. But he didn't let it consume him. This wasn't over. He might have been handcuffed, humiliated, and underestimated, but James knew something the officers didn't. The fight was just beginning. The patrol car moved slowly through the streets, the faint rumble of its engine mixing with the muted sounds of the city outside. James sat in the back seat, his hands still cuffed tightly behind him, the sharp bite of the metal a cruel reminder of the power dynamic at play. He kept his eyes on the passing buildings, his expression calm, though inside, a storm was brewing. Each second that ticked by, each turn the car made toward the station, felt like a deliberate act of defiance against everything he had built. He thought of the courtroom, the bench where he presided over cases with fairness and precision. Tonight, however, he wasn't a judge, at least not in their eyes. He was just a suspect, just another man who didn't fit the mold of what they thought success should look like. The two officers in the front seat were silent for a moment, but James could feel their tension. The driver kept glancing at him through the rearview mirror, his eyes sharp and probing, as if he were waiting for James to break, for him to plead or lash out, anything that would justify the treatment they had subjected him to. "Crazy, isn't it?" The officer in the passenger seat finally spoke, breaking the quiet. His voice was casual, almost amused. "Guy like him driving a car like that. Bet it doesn't even belong to him." The driver chuckled, though it sounded forced. "Yeah, guess we'll see when we get to the station. Maybe he'll remember where he really got it from." James clenched his jaw, but said nothing. Their words didn't surprise him. They never did. This wasn't about the car, or the suit, or the license that clearly showed the vehicle was his. This was about something much deeper, something ingrained in the way they saw him, the way they chose to define him before he even opened his mouth. As they approached the station, the driver turned sharply into the lot, the tires crunching over loose gravel. James braced himself as the car came to a sudden stop, the jolt sending a dull ache through his wrists where the cuffs bit into his skin. The officers got out first, moving quickly to open the back door. The one who had been driving yanked James out with unnecessary force, gripping his arm tightly as he led him toward the station's entrance. Inside, the fluorescent lights were harsh, casting a cold, sterile glow over the small lobby. A few officers loitered near the desk, their conversations dying down as James was brought in. Their eyes flicked toward him, then to his suit, and back to the cuffs on his wrists. One of the officers behind the desk raised an eyebrow. "What's the story here?" he asked, his tone more curious than concerned. "Suspicious behavior," the first officer replied, his grip on James' arm tightening slightly. "We'll see what he has to say in the interrogation room." James exhaled slowly, keeping his head held high as they led him down a narrow hallway. He knew this station. He had been here before, though never like this. He had sat in meeting rooms with officers and attorneys, discussing cases, building strategies. But tonight, they were treating him like a criminal, and the irony was almost too much to bear. The interrogation room was small and bare, its walls a dull gray, and its only furniture a metal table and 2 chairs. The first officer pushed James into one of the chairs, the legs screeching against the floor as he sat down. "Let's make this simple," the officer said, pulling out a notepad and sitting across from him. His partner leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching James like a hawk. "You're going to tell us how you got that car. And don't waste our time with any more stories." James tilted his head slightly, his eyes meeting the officer's with a quiet intensity. "I've already told you the truth," he said, his voice calm but firm. "That car is mine. My name is on the registration, and everything is legal." The officer smirked, leaning back in his chair. Sure it is. Guys like you always have a good story, don't they? But we both know there's more to it. For a moment, James said nothing. He simply watched the man across from him, studying him the way he would study a witness on the stand. Then, with deliberate slowness, he leaned forward, the cuffs on his wrists clinking softly against the edge of the table. "You think you know me," he said, his voice low and steady. "You think you've got me all figured out. But let me tell you something, you don't. You have no idea who I am, or what I've been through to get here." The officer's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered. "Oh, we'll figure it out," he said, though his confidence seemed a little less certain now. "Guys like you always slip up eventually." James leaned back, a faint, humorless smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "We'll see," he said simply. The tension in the room was thick, neither side willing to break. But James knew something they didn't. The game they were playing was about to take a turn they wouldn't see coming. James sat silently in the cold interrogation room, his mind a calculated storm of thoughts. He had always been taught that calmness was power, and tonight was no exception. The officers, still confident in their assumption that they had the upper hand, continued to circle him like sharks sensing blood in the water. The first officer slammed a hand on the table, breaking the tense silence. "You think this is a game?" he snapped, his voice sharp. "You're gonna sit there and act like you've got nothing to hide." James didn't flinch. Instead, he locked eyes with the officer, his expression unreadable. "I've already told you everything you need to know," he replied, his voice low and unwavering. "The problem isn't what I'm hiding. The problem is what you refuse to see." The second officer, still leaning against the wall, let out a cynical laugh. "Oh, here we go. Let me guess. You're the victim now, right? Always the same story. You people are all the same." The words hung in the air, venomous and heavy. James felt his fists tighten in the cuffs behind his back, but he refused to let them see how deeply their words cut. They wanted him to break, to give them a reason to say, "I told you so." But he wouldn't. Instead, he straightened in his chair, his eyes cold and piercing. "I'll say this one last time," he said, his voice steady but sharp as a blade. "That car is mine. It's registered in my name. And if you'd done your job instead of playing judge and jury, you'd already know that." The first officer scoffed, leaning forward on the table. "Oh, we're doing our job, all right. And you're not going anywhere until we get to the bottom of this." He turned to his partner. "Get on the radio. Run his name again. Let's see if anything else pops up." The second officer nodded, stepping out of the room. James watched him go, his pulse steady despite the anger simmering just beneath the surface. He knew this wasn't about the car. It never had been. This was about the assumptions they'd made the second they saw him behind the wheel of a luxury vehicle, assumptions they were now desperately trying to justify. Minutes passed in silence. The officer left in the room with James busied himself with his notepad, scribbling things that James was certain had nothing to do with the truth. James, meanwhile, sat motionless, his expression calm, but his mind working through every possible outcome. When the door finally opened, it wasn't the second officer who returned. Instead, it was someone James didn't recognize, a man in a sharp, dark suit, his presence commanding as he strode into the room. Behind him were two other individuals, both wearing uniforms that clearly signified higher ranks than the officers who had detained James. The first officer's face went pale. "Captain," he stammered, straightening awkwardly. "I didn't know you were coming down here tonight." The man in the suit ignored him, his sharp gaze landing directly on James. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension almost suffocating. Then, the man turned to the officer, his expression hardening. "Is this him?" he asked, his tone sharp and controlled. "Yes, sir," the officer replied, his voice faltering slightly. We brought him in for questioning. Suspicious behavior." The man in the suit's jaw tightened. "Suspicious behavior," he repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "Is that what you're calling this?" The officer opened his mouth to respond, but the man cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Do you have any idea who this is?" The room went dead silent. The officer blinked, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. James remained still, watching the scene unfold with a quiet intensity. "This man," the captain continued, his voice rising, "is Judge James Carter, one of the most respected legal minds in this city. And you brought him in here, cuffed him like a criminal, humiliated him, without cause." The officer's face turned ashen. I didn't know." "You didn't know," the captain snapped. "Did you bother to find out? Or did you just assume that because of the color of his skin and the car he drives, he must be guilty of something?" The words hit like a hammer, and the officer stumbled over his response. "We were just doing our job." "No," the captain interrupted sharply. "What you did tonight wasn't just reckless. It was disgraceful. And I can assure you, there will be consequences." James watched the scene play out, his expression calm, but his heart pounding with a mix of vindication and exhaustion. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time that night, the balance of power had shifted. "Get those cuffs off him," the captain ordered, his voice firm. The officer hesitated, his hands fumbling as he stepped toward James. The cuffs clicked open, and James flexed his wrists, feeling the blood rush back to his hands. He stood slowly, towering over the officer, who now looked like he wished the floor would swallow him whole. The captain turned to James, his expression softening slightly. "Judge Carter, I can't begin to express how sorry I am for what you've been through tonight. Please know that this matter will be addressed immediately." James nodded, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "Thank you, Captain. But this isn't just about me. This is about a system that allows things like this to happen every day. I'll make sure this doesn't get buried." The captain's eyes flickered with understanding, and he nodded. "I'll do everything in my power to make sure it doesn't." As James walked out of the interrogation room, the weight of the night still lingered on his shoulders. But now there was something else, a determination to turn this moment of humiliation into a catalyst for change. The station was eerily quiet as James Carter walked down the hallway, his steps steady, his head held high. The humiliation of the night clung to him, but so did the undeniable shift in energy. Everyone who passed him, officers, desk clerks, even detainees, seemed to know who he was now. Their glances were quick, filled with curiosity, embarrassment, or guilt. The handcuffs were gone, but the weight of what had happened still pressed on his chest. The captain walked beside him, speaking in low tones. "Judge Carter, I'll personally make sure a report is filed. This will not go unnoticed. You have my word." James gave a polite nod but said nothing. Words, he thought, were easy. Accountability was something else entirely. As he stepped out into the crisp night air, he took a moment to breathe deeply. The city seemed different now, quieter but not peaceful. Across the street, a small crowd had gathered, onlookers who had witnessed the initial arrest, some still holding their phones up, their cameras pointed at him. Their whispers floated through the air. "That's him, the guy they cuffed. Wait, isn't he a judge or something?" "Yeah, I heard he's one of the top judges in the state." James ignored the murmurs, keeping his focus on his car still parked by the curb. The officers who had humiliated him were nowhere to be seen. Whether they were hiding out of shame or awaiting a reprimand, he didn't know, and he didn't care. Sliding into the driver's seat, James closed the door and gripped the steering wheel tightly for a moment. The leather felt cold against his palms, but it grounded him, bringing him back to the present. He could have driven off, left the night behind him, but he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he reached for his phone, which had been returned to him moments ago. His fingers hovered over the screen as he debated his next move. He had friends, colleagues, and allies who would be outraged to hear about this. But this wasn't just about venting or seeking sympathy. This was about something much bigger. He opened his camera app, angling the phone so that the police station loomed in the background. The floodlights illuminated the building, giving it an almost surreal glow. For a moment, he stared at the screen, his reflection superimposed over the station, a stark reminder of how the system he upheld every day had failed him so completely tonight. With a steady hand, James hit record. "My name is James Carter," he began, his voice calm but filled with purpose. And tonight, I was detained, handcuffed, and humiliated by officers who assumed that a black man in a nice car must be a criminal. What they didn't know is that I'm a judge, one who has spent his career fighting for justice, even within a system that continues to fail people who look like me." He paused, his jaw tightening as he chose his next words carefully. "But this isn't just about me. This is about the countless others who don't have a title to protect them. This is about the everyday injustices that go unseen, unspoken, and unpunished. It has to stop, and I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure it does." James stopped recording and stared at the screen for a moment, the raw emotion in his voice, the weight of his words. It was all there, captured in a way he knew couldn't be ignored. With a single press, he uploaded the video to his social media accounts. Within seconds, notifications began to flood in. Likes, shares, comments. But James didn't linger. He set the phone down and started the engine, the low hum filling the silence. As he drove away, the weight in his chest began to shift. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But now, the spotlight wasn't just on him. It was on the system, the officers, the assumptions that led to nights like this. And James knew that once the world saw what had happened, there would be no turning back. By the time he got home, his phone was buzzing relentlessly. Friends, journalists, activists, and even strangers were reaching out, their voices joining a chorus of outrage. James sat at his kitchen table, scrolling through the flood of messages. "Unbelievable. This is why we need change. Thank you for speaking up. You're not alone. We stand with you, Judge Carter." As the notifications piled up, James felt a small, resolute fire ignite within him. The fight was just beginning, but he wasn't afraid. Tonight wasn't just a personal injustice. It was a call to action. By morning, James Carter's video had gone viral. What had started as a raw, late-night confession had transformed into a national rallying cry. The hashtags #JusticeForJudgeCarter and #StopRacialProfiling were trending across platforms, with thousands of people sharing their own stories of discrimination and profiling. The story was no longer just James. It was a reflection of a systemic issue that had gone unchallenged for too long. James woke to his phone vibrating incessantly on the bedside table. The screen was flooded with notifications, missed calls, texts, emails, and social media mentions. He rubbed his eyes and sat up, scrolling through the chaos. "Judge Carter, this is Sarah Collins from Channel 9 News. We'd love an exclusive interview." "James, it's Mark. Call me. We need to strategize." "Mr. Carter, this is Representative Moore's office. She'd like to speak with you about your experience." He put the phone down, staring out the window as the sunlight filtered into the room. His life had already changed, and it wasn't even 8 a.m. Downstairs, he brewed a pot of coffee and sat at his dining table, his laptop open to the morning news. His own face stared back at him from the screen, accompanied by headlines that ranged from outrage to sensational. "Respected judge detained in racial profiling incident. Judge Carter speaks out. This isn't just about me. Is this the tipping point for police accountability?" James sipped his coffee, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was a movement. People were rallying behind him, but he also knew the backlash would come. His assistant, Nicole, called just as he finished his first cup. "James," she said, her voice quick and urgent, "you're everywhere. Every major outlet is covering this. We've had calls from CNN, MSNBC. Even BBC wants a comment." James exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "And the reaction?" "It's overwhelming," she said. "Most people are on your side, but you've got some critics too. A few think you're exaggerating, calling it a publicity stunt. And, well, some are trying to twist it into a not-all-cops narrative." James wasn't surprised. He had seen it before. The desperate attempts to deflect, to minimize, to avoid addressing the deeper truth. "I expected that," he said calmly. "Nicole, I need you to set up a press conference for this afternoon. Nothing too elaborate. Just me, a podium, and a clear message." Nicole hesitated. "Are you sure? This is already blowing up. A press conference could add fuel to the fire." That's exactly what I want, James said firmly. The fire needs to burn. People need to see the truth, unfiltered. By noon, the courthouse steps were packed. Journalists with cameras, microphones, and notepads crowded together, their chatter filling the air. Supporters held signs with phrases like, "Justice for all," and "Enough is enough." When James stepped out of the building, the crowd erupted into applause. He adjusted his tie and approached the podium, his face calm but resolute. The cameras clicked furiously as he began to speak. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "Last night I experienced something that no one should ever have to endure. Being judged, detained, and humiliated not because of my actions, but because of the color of my skin. As a judge, I've dedicated my life to upholding justice. But what happened to me is a reminder that justice is not equally applied." The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. "This isn't just about me," James continued. "It's about every person who has been stopped, questioned, or mistreated simply for existing in their own skin. It's about a system that allows prejudice to thrive unchecked, turning routine interactions into nightmares for people of color. And it has to stop." He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. "I'm not here to call for the punishment of the officers involved in my case. That would be too easy, too small. Instead, I'm calling for something bigger. I'm calling for accountability, for transparency, and for reform. We need to address the root of the problem, not just the symptoms." A ripple of applause spread through the crowd, but James raised a hand to quiet it. "This isn't just my fight. It's ours. And I'm asking all of you, citizens, leaders, officers, to join me in pushing for change. Because until we confront the biases and injustices embedded in our institutions, there will be no justice for any of us." When James stepped away from the podium, the applause was thunderous. The journalists shouted questions, but he didn't stop to answer. He had said what he needed to say, and now it was up to the people to carry the message forward. As he walked back into the courthouse, his phone buzzed with a text from Nicole. "You just made headlines again. They're calling you the voice of justice." James smiled faintly, but didn't respond. He didn't need the title or the praise. All he wanted was change. The ripple effect of James Carter's press conference was immediate and powerful. Within hours, clips of his speech flooded every corner of the internet. Social media was ablaze, his words striking a chord with millions who had felt unseen and unheard. Across the country, conversations were happening, in living rooms, in classrooms, in offices. The question on everyone's lips was the same. If even a judge isn't safe from racial profiling, who is? James spent the evening at his desk, scrolling through the endless waves of responses online. The outpouring of support was humbling, but it was the personal stories that struck him the hardest. "Judge Carter, thank you for speaking up. My son was stopped last month for no reason, and I've been terrified for him ever since. Your courage gives us hope. This fight is long overdue. I've lived this my entire life. Thank you for using your platform to bring attention to it." But mixed in with the support were the predictable waves of resistance. Anonymous accounts questioned his integrity, downplayed his experience, or accused him of playing the race card. Others defended the officers, calling them justified or claiming James was being overly sensitive. One particularly venomous post read, "Another entitled elitist crying racism. Maybe he deserved it." James clenched his jaw as he read the words, but he didn't let them linger. He had spent years building resilience against voices like these. They were loud, yes, but they weren't the majority. Not this time. He closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The events of the past 24 hours were surreal. He had gone from a quiet ride home to the face of a national movement. And while the attention was daunting, James knew this was a moment that couldn't be wasted. The next morning, his assistant Nicole arrived at his house early, her arms full of papers and her phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, he's here," she said to whoever was on the line. "We'll get back to you with a time for the meeting." She hung up and turned to James, her expression a mix of exhaustion and determination. "You're booked solid today," she said, dropping the papers onto his dining table. "Civil rights groups want to meet with you. There's a coalition planning a rally downtown, and several lawmakers want to discuss potential policy reforms. Oh, and CNN wants you on their primetime segment tonight. James raised an eyebrow. Anything else? He asked dryly. Nicole gave a tired laugh. I'm pretty sure the president's office is next. James rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of it all. It's happening so fast, he said, more to himself than to her. This movement, it's like it has a life of its own now. Nicole nodded, her expression softening. That's because it's not just about you anymore, James. This is bigger than one person. You lit the match, but the fire was already waiting to start. Her words stayed with him as he navigated the whirlwind of meetings and interviews that followed. Every conversation was a reminder of how deeply ingrained the problem was and how urgent the need for change had become. At the rally downtown, thousands of people gathered, holding signs that read "Justice for All" and "End Profiling Now." When James took the stage, the crowd erupted into cheers, their voices a thunderous wave of support. "Thank you," James began, his voice steady despite the overwhelming emotion of the moment. "Thank you for standing here today. Not for me, but for the countless lives affected by a system that must change." He paused, scanning the sea of faces before continuing. "This isn't about me being a judge. This isn't about my car or my title. This is about what happens when we let prejudice go unchecked. This is about creating a future where no one has to live in fear of being judged for the color of their skin." The crowd roared, and James felt a surge of energy unlike anything he had ever experienced. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for a community, for a movement, for a cause that demanded action. As he stepped down from the stage, James was approached by a group of young activists, their eyes bright with determination. "Judge Carter," one of them said, her voice trembling with emotion, "thank you for giving us hope. We've been fighting for this for so long, but with you leading the charge, it feels like we might finally be heard." James smiled, his heart heavy but full. "It's not just me," he said. "It's all of us. Change doesn't come from one voice. It comes from all of us speaking together." That night, as James prepared for his CNN appearance, he sat quietly for a moment, reflecting on everything that had led to this point. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like the tide was turning. He adjusted his tie in the mirror, his reflection staring back at him with a mix of exhaustion and resolve. This wasn't just about speaking out anymore. It was about action, about holding the system accountable, about turning this moment into a movement that couldn't be ignored. "Let's do this," he muttered to himself as he stepped out of his room, ready to face the next battle. The interview room at CNN was bathed in soft lighting, the cameras poised and ready, their red lights glowing like watchful eyes. James Carter adjusted his tie one last time and sat tall in his chair, the weight of the day settling over him like a second suit. Across from him, the host, a seasoned journalist known for sharp, probing questions, offered a reassuring nod. "We're live in 3, 2, 1. The camera zoomed in, framing James as the host spoke directly into the lens. "Tonight, we're joined by Judge James Carter, whose viral video and powerful calls for justice have sparked a national conversation on racial profiling and systemic bias. Judge Carter, thank you for being here." "Thank you for having me," James replied, his voice calm but firm. The interview began with the host recounting the events of the fateful night, his unlawful detainment, the humiliation, and the eventual revelation of his identity. As she spoke, James relived every moment, but he kept his expression steady. "Judge Carter," the host continued, "your experience has struck a chord with millions of people. Why do you think your story, in particular, has resonated so deeply?" James took a breath, his thoughts clear and deliberate. "Because my story isn't unique," he said, his voice carrying the weight of truth. "What happened to me happens to people across this country every single day. The only difference is that I had a title, a platform, to shine a light on it. But there are countless others who endure the same injustices without anyone noticing, without anyone caring. This isn't just my story, it's theirs too." The host nodded, her expression serious. "Since your press conference, we've seen widespread support, but also criticism. Some have accused you of exaggerating or of using this as a platform for personal gain. How do you respond to that? James leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. This isn't about me, he said firmly. It never was. My success, my title, my achievements, they didn't protect me that night. And they don't protect millions of others who face systemic bias every day. If my story can bring attention to that reality, then I'm willing to take the criticism. This isn't about ego. It's about change. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The host pressed on. You've called for systemic reform. What does that look like in practice? James' expression grew sharper, more determined. It starts with accountability, he said. We need transparency in policing, body cameras, unbiased investigations into misconduct, and an end to the culture of silence that protects bad actors. But it doesn't stop there. We need to confront the biases embedded in our institutions, schools, workplaces, courts. Change isn't just about laws. It's about changing hearts, minds, and systems. The interview ended with a powerful closing message from James. We can't undo the past, he said, his voice resolute. But we can decide what kind of future we want to build. I believe in justice. Not just for me, but for everyone. And I won't stop fighting until that justice is a reality. When the cameras stopped rolling, James leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. The producer approached him with a warm smile. That was incredible, Judge Carter. Thank you for sharing your truth. James nodded, offering a polite smile before leaving the studio. As he stepped outside, the cool night air greeted him, and with it, a quiet sense of hope. His phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket, but for once, he ignored it. As he drove home, the city felt different. For the first time, it wasn't the weight of injustice that he carried, but the momentum of change. He thought about the young activists he had met, the families who had reached out to share their pain, and the countless people who had taken to the streets to demand better. This was no longer just a fight for justice. It was a movement, and it was growing. When James pulled into his driveway, he paused before stepping out of the car. He looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror, the man staring back at him no longer just a judge, but a voice for something much larger. Inside, his assistant Nicole was waiting, papers in hand and a phone to her ear. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting up with a grin. The president's office called, she said. They wanted me to discuss your proposals. James raised an eyebrow, but chuckled softly. Well, I guess I'd better start drafting them. Nicole laughed, but quickly sobered. James, you're making history here. You know that, right? James nodded, his expression serious. It's not about making history, he said. It's about making sure this never happens again. To anyone. As the night stretched on, James sat at his desk, drafting policies, writing emails, and preparing for what he knew would be a long battle. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood millions of voices demanding change, and ahead of him was a chance to finally make it happen. And as the first light of dawn broke through his window, James felt it. Not an ending, but a beginning. Justice was no longer a distant hope. It was within reach, and he was ready to fight for it.